Hello and welcome to the programme which looks at the Holy Land. I am Paul Calvert. Psalm 11 verse 11 from the New King James Bible says this: For the Lord is righteous, he loves righteousness, his countenance beholds the upright. I'm with Stephen Silverman from the Campaign Against Antisemitism. Now, Stephen, what sort of projects do you do to counter antisemitism?
Well, they are very wide and varied. A lot of it is fairly mundane, day-to-day work, which is writing letters to organizations, institutions, venues about things that have either occurred that they need to address or things that may be about to occur that they need to stop occurring. So, for example, you'll be familiar with Bob Vylan, the band that from the Glastonbury stage whipped the crowd up into a chant of death, death to the IDF. So since then, we have been successful in ensuring that where they are due to appear at a certain venue, we're able to get that stopped to prevent any more incitement of that kind of hatred. So that's the bread and butter work. We also do a lot of work supporting employees who are suffering discrimination. Now, this isn't anything new, but it has been given rocket fuel since October the 7th, 2023, and where people are being discriminated against in the work they get, the way they are treated, the abuse they receive, simply because they are Jewish, or sometimes because they are actually Israeli, and the organisation they work for is failing to deal with it properly, so we are able to help them. We will provide them with proper legal advisors and fund their claims against those organisations. We do an awful lot of litigation in the criminal sphere. We have learned, sadly, to our cost, that we cannot trust the criminal justice system to do what it should do where Jewish interests are concerned. All too often, crimes that would either be investigated by the police or where they are investigated but the police are not then prosecuted by the Crown Prosecution Service. Where that happens, we will step in and are able to do things like take institutions to court via a judicial review or launch our own private prosecutions. And we have a number of very high-profile prosecutions that are running at the moment. And then we also do a lot of work defending Jews and allies of Jews who are forcefully arrested when attending counter-protests, often because it's easier to arrest the counter-protester than risk inflaming the mob by arresting the individuals there who are taking exception to the counter-protester. Time and time again, the same individuals are being arrested, and when we support them, their cases are either dropped or thrown out when they reach court. We do a lot of education and outreach work, delivering training on anti-Semitism to a huge range of institutions and organisations, national health trusts, government bodies, private organisations, police forces. So the work we do is very wide and varied.
Now, you mentioned the Bob Vylan incident at Glastonbury where he shouted death, death to the IDF. Did anything actually ever come of that? Was he ever prosecuted?
No, he has not been prosecuted, and that, we believe, is a source of great shame. In the same way that the Irish band Kneecap wasn't prosecuted, they were the ones openly expressing support for Hezbollah and being seen in Hezbollah dress, and that didn't go anywhere either. So we do have some serious issues here where anti-Semitism and extremism are not being dealt with properly. And that's the work we are trying to do to plug that gap.
So who's to blame for that?
That is a question which I think is both very difficult to answer in some ways because it goes to the motivation, but also quite straightforward to answer. What we have seen is appeasement of anti-Semitism and extremism that has led with each concession to an increase in anti-Semitism and extremism. And we see it in our criminal justice system, where police forces are clearly applying the most obvious of double standards in who they will arrest and who they won't arrest for racially aggravated offences. And Jews are coming out with a raw deal as far as that is concerned. We're seeing it in our industry regulators, who are regularly turning a blind eye to the most egregious anti-Semitism. There is a very notorious doctor at the moment in the NHS, a doctor called Rahme Aladwan, who has been using social media and public appearances to basically wage a war against British Jews, glorifying what happened on the 7th of October, reproducing Hamas propaganda, demanding that Jewish supremacy needs to be eradicated, and she basically includes all Jews in that title of Jewish supremacy, calling various hospitals things like a cesspit of Jewish supremacy. And her medical regulator failed to suspend her while under investigation. They decided that she hadn't done anything to bring the profession into disrepute at that point, and that no reasonable person would be alarmed by her being allowed to continue to practice unimpeded, which is very interesting because although the medical regulator couldn't see a problem, even our police forces could, and the Metropolitan Police arrested her yesterday on suspicion of inciting racial hatred. So this is a problem that we're seeing being replicated across our industry regulators. Our universities are complicit for allowing anti-Semitism to have free rein on campus. You know, we have students and academic staff coming to us, pleading with us to help them because they're forced either to do their studies or carry out their lectures with mobs feet away from their windows, basically calling for their deaths. Our national broadcaster and other broadcasters, but the BBC in particular, are complicit in this because they have failed in the most extreme way imaginable, not only to represent Israel's war against Hamas in a balanced way, but literally to amplify Hamas propaganda. Everything that Hamas states issues as a statement, everything that Israel says is a claim yet to be substantiated. And it has played a large part in the escalation of hatred towards British Jews. And overseeing all of that, at the end of the day, the government is to blame. In fact, successive governments have been to blame, but this particular government has now been in place for almost a year and a half, during which the worst escalation in anti-Semitism has been seen. And all they have had is fine words that anti-Semitism has no place in our society, and yet they have done absolutely nothing to ensure that it has no place in our society. It is very well entrenched in our society now. So that's why it's happened, but why they're actually behaving in this way, it's hard to be certain. It is almost certainly a combination, one or more, of fear of confronting the mob, vested political interests, or maybe even ideological sympathy with them. It's hard to be sure. But what we do know is that it has left the British Jewish community in a very, very precarious situation. And, you know, our work is to try to ameliorate that as best we can.
Two of the recent things we've just seen in the UK that's happened is Jews were banned from a Maccabi Tel Aviv game that was going to be played in Aston Villa. And also, as well, a Jew was arrested for wearing a Star of David. Is this just trying to protect the community, or is this anti-Semitism?
Well, you know, in the space of literally a couple of weeks, we have had Jews murdered outside a synagogue on Yom Kippur. We have had a medical regulator finding no problem with the behaviour of a doctor who is spouting literally Nazi-era propaganda about Jews. As you say, we've had a man arrested because his Star of David is provoking a hateful mob. And now we've had Maccabi Tel Aviv fans banned from attending a match in Aston Villa, which it is patently clear was done, not for the safety of the local community, but because the authorities clearly recognised that the Maccabi fans would be at risk of a similar event that occurred in Amsterdam about a year ago, when after a match against Ajax, Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were hunted through the streets in something that was called by the perpetrators a Jew hunt that had been planned well in advance. So that's where we are. And yes, clearly anti-Semitism is at the heart of this. And, it is astonishing and shocking to hear a police officer making comments about the man wearing the Star of David while he was being interviewed. Because, look, we don't know if this man did or did not commit a criminal offence. But that is largely irrelevant. The issue is that in interview, he was being told that a contributing factor to that offence was his wearing of a Star of David, which would inflame the mob. Now, if the sight of a Jewish man is hateful to a mob, the problem is the hateful mob, not the Jewish man. And that was a real low. The only person endangered by wearing a Star of David is the Jew who chooses to wear it in public. Because by expressing his identity in that way, he runs a risk of abuse, violence, and now of being arrested for being openly Jewish.
Now, we've seen pro-Palestinian marches on the streets, like in London, and obviously people have a right to march against whatever they like. Are these anti-Semitic, though? We're hearing from the river to the sea being chanted. Is that actually anti-Semitic?
Well, finally, our Prime Minister has stood up and said that it is. We know it is. We've always known it is, despite the gaslighting to the contrary, as is calls for violent jihad and a call to globalise the Intifada, which is code for let's kill all the Jews. But those marches have never, ever been about peace or about Palestinian rights, because if they had been, the people on those marches would have been calling for the things that would have stopped the war immediately and brought an end to the suffering of the Gazan people. The surrender of Hamas and the release of the hostages. But you never heard that. All you ever heard were calls for globalising the Intifada and the destruction of the world's only Jewish state. And the mask is off now because they've said they're going to continue, irrespective of the ceasefire and the peace plan, until Israel doesn't exist anymore, which obviously isn't going to happen. These are and always have been hate marches. And it is so salutary to think, if you look at the literally hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Yemen, the hundreds of thousands of children who have literally died of starvation. If you look at is it almost 1 million Uyghur Muslims in China in concentration camps? What happened between Israel and Gaza is a relatively minor conflict, yet you would think this was the only issue going on in the world. Why? Because it involves Jews.
Now, we've seen a terror attack take place in Manchester. Are Jews fearful that globalize the Intifada is actually happening today now?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I mean, and it didn't happen for the first time in Manchester. We knew it happened earlier this year in Washington, D.C., when 2 Israeli embassy staffers were murdered outside a function. And we always knew it was just a matter of time before the Intifada arrived at these shores in all its violent horror. And it did. And the fear is that, this is not the end of it. We know the police reported only a short while after that they had intercepted somebody who was planning to carry out a mass event targeting Jews. So the worry is this is just round the corner the whole time now. And the shame of it, the scandal of it is that things have been brought to this pitch by rhetoric and narrative that amplifies the propaganda of a terrorist organisation that is prescribed in this country. And there are a lot of people who are to blame for this and who should be hanging their heads in shame.
Are Jews hiding their Jewishness today in the UK?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. Most Jews now. Certainly in urban environments, will cover, if they wear a kippah because they're observant, they'll cover that with a baseball cap or something, or will tuck their Star of David inside their clothing. It's commonplace now.
What percentage of Jews are considering leaving the UK?
Over half now, when it's already started. But, we know that, we know that that conversation is taking place around the dinner tables now of most Jewish families. Do we really have a place here in the foreseeable future? And the reason for that is very obvious, because things are really, really bad today. You know, it makes me cross when I hear people talk about rising anti-Semitism. That makes it sound as though it's something that's only started relatively recently and can be nipped in the bud. It's not. It is now a pandemic affecting our Western democracies. This is really serious. And to turn it around is going to take a very, very long time. But there's no sign of any meaningful action being taken to do that, other than perhaps in the USA. But, you know, we conducted a survey a couple of months ago in conjunction with YouGov, a recognised polling organisation, on people's attitudes towards Jews. And what that found was that 21% of the public are now anti-Semitic. And the measure for that is that they hold 4 or more anti-Semitic views to be true. You know, things about Jews and power, Jews and the media, Jews and money, this kind of thing. The influence of Israel over our government. That 21% increases to 40% in the youngest demographic, the 18 to 24-year-olds, our future judge, our future judges, our future MPs, our future lawyers. So this is a really, really situation. So it's no wonder that most Jews are really concerned about what future they have here.
Are the media to blame for this?
The media are hugely to blame. As I said earlier, the BBC in particular, but certainly others, many other major broadcasters, have openly amplified Hamas propaganda and have taken a vehement anti-Israel staff. They're not just telling people what has happened, they are telling people what to think about what has happened. And what the message that they are giving, usually subtly, sometimes not so subtly, is that Israel is a unique evil in the world. And that therefore, by extension, anyone who refuses to disavow Israel is equally evil. And that is how we arrive at a situation where somebody turns up at a synagogue on Yom Kippur and stabs several Jews, killing 2 of them.
Are you seeing good prosecutions for anti-Semitism?
Well, no. That's why we're doing our own private prosecutions. And we're doing them across the spectrum. The radical left, Islamist extremists and the far right. And we are prosecuting and being successful with cases that the police said, no, nothing to see here, that the CPS refused to charge. So we should not be having to do this. It has always been our preference to allow the criminal justice system to do the work it's meant to do. But that is failing the Jewish community badly and has been for some time now.
Do you feel like you're making a difference?
I hope we are. One thing that's very important is that I think people need to understand that although Jews are the target here, this isn't about, us saying, look at what's happening to the poor Jewish community, isn't it terrible? It's about getting the silent majority, and there is a very large silent majority who does not like what it's seeing, getting the silent majority to understand that this is something that affects the very fabric of society, that completely undermines the liberal democratic values that everyone relies on to keep them safe. And that if we get to the point where all the Jews leave, someone else is going to be next. And we think we're being successful now in that messaging.
What is your hope for the future of the Jewish community in the UK?
My hope is that it stays strong and that there is still a Jewish community in the UK in 10, 20 years' time. For that to happen, we need to see government in particular taking a far, far stronger line than it has to date and actually taking really strong action and clamping down on anti-Semitism with an iron fist rather than just talking about it. I mean, remember, we have a Prime Minister who, when he took over as leader of the Labour Party 5 years ago, swore, in his own words, to tear out anti-Semitism by the roots. Well, under his premiership, those roots are deeper than ever and they are thicker than ever. So he needs to get a move on.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more about the work that you do or even report an anti-Semitic incident?
Yeah, if people want to go to antisemitism.org, and that's anti-Semitism without a hyphen, then they will find us there.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much for sharing today.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for joining us today. Pray that God will move by his mighty power in the Holy Land and bring his peace.